He was barely breathing when she found him. Just past the edge of her land, under a sky heavy with snow, a man lay twisted by a fallen tree, blood soaked through his shirt. His hand clutched a revolver, though his fingers no longer had the strength to pull the trigger. Most folks would have ridden past. Most would have let the cold finish him. But she knelt beside the stranger, pale and still, and whispered, "Don't die here." Then she dragged his broken body through the snow. No one helped her, not when she stumbled into town for medicine with his blood staining her dress. Not when she asked the doctor for laudanum and gauze. Folks glanced at the trail she left and looked away. She patched him up in her father's old barn, the same place where Silence had lived since her brother died last spring. The stranger had a bullet near his spine and a scar on his cheek that split his face in two. He never woke to thank her, and when he was strong enough to ride, he did just that without a word, without a name. That should have been the end. But a year later, he came back, not limping, not wounded. This time he came on horseback, with 6 riders behind him and a storm in his eyes. Dust rose like ghosts in his wake. He dismounted like a man who'd spent a lifetime being hunted, then stepped through her gate as if it were his. She stood in the doorway, the same as she had that winter night. Her hair longer now, her voice still quiet. The riders waited outside, watching her like they'd been told what she was, or what she'd done. The man spoke, low and rough. "You saved me. Now I'm here to save you." Then he turned to the men on their horses and said, "This woman's my bride," and not one of them dared argue. She hadn't been called anyone's anything in years. Not since her father drank himself into the ground and left the land to rot beneath her feet. Not since the boy she'd once loved died in a flood and the town whispered it was her fault. They never said it to her face, no one dared. But their silence was louder than any stone thrown. They just stopped looking at her altogether. At the edge of town, she kept to herself. A woman with no husband, no children, no kin left to speak of. Her name was Mary Eltane, though most had long forgotten it. Folks called her that girl up near Hollow Creek, as if she were part of the wilderness, something that existed, not someone who lived. She survived by growing turnips in a patch of frost-bitten soil and trading eggs for flour. Her hands had more scars than her memories did. Some days, the wind howled so fiercely through the slats in her roof, she wondered if it was trying to carry her away. Other days, she stood in the stillness and begged too. There had been kindness in her once, a soft place in her chest that used to believe people were worth saving. That's what made her drag that half-dead man out of the snow and lay him on the table where she used to knead bread. She remembered the shape of his wound, how the blood had crusted down his side. Remembered stitching it closed with shaking fingers and telling him not to die, not because she knew him, but because he looked like he'd been left behind one too many times. She didn't expect him to live, and when he did, she didn't expect him to vanish without thanks. But it hurt, deeper than she admitted. She sat on the edge of her bed for nights after, wondering if maybe that was the kind of person she was, a woman people used, then left behind. Like her mother, like every promise ever whispered in the dark. The day he returned, she wasn't ready. She'd just finished feeding the chickens and her apron was damp from the creek. Her hair was loose. The porch boards groaned beneath her bare feet as the sound of hooves approached. At first, she thought it was trouble, some sheriff come to collect tax she couldn't pay or a drifter looking for scraps. But then she saw him. Same face, same scar, but harder now, more defined by sun and sin. A leather duster clung to his frame like a shadow. and behind him 6 men. Faces she didn't know, but eyes that made her skin tighten. She should have shut the door, should have told him to leave. Instead, she stood there as if nailed to the earth, the wind catching her hair like it remembered too. And then he said it. Words she hadn't heard in a lifetime. "This woman's my bride." The men shifted in their saddles, but didn't move. The weight of their silence fell across her porch like a storm cloud. She could feel it in her bones that this was not some romantic declaration. This was protection disguised as possession. It was a warning. He turned to her then, eyes not pleading, not soft but searching. "Let me inside." She didn't know why she stepped back, didn't understand what made her hands unclench the doorframe. He passed her like a ghost she'd buried and opened the past with every footstep. Inside, nothing had changed. The same crooked table, the dent in the wall from a pan thrown long ago, the chair he once bled on. He took off his coat slow, like a man who'd been hunted too long. Underneath, he wore a pistol on each hip and a bruise that hadn't faded. He sat like someone waiting for judgment. "You shouldn't have brought them here," she said at last. "They're not here for you. They're here because of me, and what am I?" He looked up, jaw tight. Safe, she almost laughed. A hollow thing. Because safety had never been a word that belonged to her. Not on this land. Not in this skin. "You left," she whispered. "I had to. You could have said something. I didn't know if I'd live long enough to mean it." She stepped away, hands trembling. The barn still stood behind the house. It smelled of blood and winter and the past. She'd never gone back inside after he left. It had become a shrine to her own foolishness, a place where she remembered hoping too hard. He followed her glance through the window and said nothing. Outside, the wind picked up. The riders still waited, silent as stones. One of them adjusted his rifle. Another spat tobacco into the dirt. Something heavy hung in the air. A secret. Coiled tight. He rose, stepped to her side, voice low. "They're not men I can outrun. Then why bring them? Because someone's coming. And when they do, they'll come here first." She didn't flinch. Because she knew. Somehow she'd known from. The moment she saw his eyes again. Trouble had always been part of him. And now it was part of her too. She remembered the first time he opened his eyes. Back then, his face was fevered and pale, his mouth cracked from thirst. He tried to reach for his gun even as he bled, more instinct than choice. But his hands had no strength, and she had no fear. Only a quiet patience that came from years of being left alone with the wind and the dirt. His name had never been asked. She never needed it. He was the kind of man you recognized by the way silence moved with him, like a second shadow. There was no kindness in him back then, only the fight to keep breathing. But now, as he stood once more beneath her roof, older and less wild in the eyes, that same silence clung to him like a familiar coat. It wasn't just the cold outside that made him speak so little, it was the weight he carried in his chest. Something unseen but felt. Something dark. She watched him as he moved through her kitchen without asking, picking up the kettle she hadn't used in days, pouring water, as if he knew this place better than anyone had a right to. And maybe he did. Maybe that winter had etched its way into his bones the same way it had hers. "I thought you died," she said softly, watching his hand tremble as he set the kettle on the stove. He didn't answer, just looked at her like someone trying to memorize a face they'd already forgotten once. Then he sat, back straight, eyes on the door. "They're bounty men," he said after a long silence. "But not for me." Not yet. She didn't ask what he meant, because she knew the look in a man's eyes when he'd killed before. And his eyes weren't haunted, they were calm, which meant he'd made peace with what he'd done, or that he never expected forgiveness. She moved around the table slowly, the wooden floor cool under her feet. And you called me your bride. It was the only way they'd leave you alone. They believe it. They'd be fools not to. He looked at her then, not as a man looks at a woman, but as a dying man looks at a place he never thought he'd see again. She wanted to ask why he came back now after so long, after so much quiet, but she didn't, because there was something else in his presence now, a strange steadiness, as if the storm outside belonged to someone else. And she found herself breathing easier with him near, even as danger hovered like frost on the windows. The wind slammed the shutters, and she reached to secure them. I buried 3 men last month, she said absently. One was found frozen in the creek. Another had been missing since autumn. Third was the preacher. Fell off his horse and hit his head on a stone. He didn't flinch, only asked who buried them. I did. No pride in it. No sorrow either. Just the truth of someone who'd done what needed doing because no one else would. She turned back and found him standing again, taller than she remembered. He walked to the hearth and knelt, lighting the fire with a flint and steel. His hands worked slow, deliberate, as if every motion was a prayer. Why did you come back? She asked, voice barely louder than the wind. He didn't answer at first. Then, because the only time I slept without waking to gunfire was here. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something older, something built from silence and breath, and the knowledge that some souls find their echo in another without speaking. Outside, one of the horses neighed sharply. The men were growing restless. They won't stay long, he said, still kneeling by the fire. And after that, he didn't look at her, just stirred the flames and said, you saved me once. That's not the kind of debt I leave behind. He stayed up that night, sitting by the window, with a rifle across his lap. He didn't sleep. She did deeper than she had in months, because something in her had started to believe if the storm came for her, it would have to pass through him first. He didn't leave the next morning, nor the one after that. The men he rode with disappeared at dawn, as silent as they'd arrived. One by one, their shadows vanished beyond the horizon, like ghosts returning to the dust. He stood on the porch and watched them go, arms crossed, jaw locked. Only when the last rider crested the ridge did he turn to her. I'll stay, he said. Just that. No reason given. And she didn't ask. There were no promises between them, only chores. She handed him a pail and pointed to the well. He fixed the fence where the boards had rotted through. He fed the mule that had grown half wild from neglect. When the roof leaked during the rain, he patched it with his own coat before he found shingles to replace the broken ones. She didn't speak much, and neither did he, but something in the quiet began to shift. He took to sleeping on the floor near the hearth. Said it kept the cold off his back, though she suspected it was habit soldiers sleep. He never took off his boots. The rifle stayed beside him, even when he dozed. At first, it unsettled her. But soon, she came to find comfort in the rhythm of his breath, the way he stirred the fire without waking her, the scent of tobacco he didn't smoke until after dark. They ate together in silence. Sometimes she'd place the bread closer to him without a word. Sometimes he'd pour her coffee before she reached the pot. One night, she woke to find him outside, chopping wood by lantern light. The snow hadn't yet come, but the wind smelled of it. He stood bare-armed despite the cold, sweat on his brow, the axe moving in slow, measured swings. She watched him from the doorway, unsure whether to call out or let the moment remain untouched. When he paused, she asked, "Why are you doing all this?" He didn't turn, just said, "Because no one else will." That was the beginning. He started calling her Ma'am less, started saying her name, Mary, soft and rare, like something he wasn't sure he deserved to hold. And she, in turn, began to leave a blanket by the hearth when she went to bed. Not for him, not directly, just in case. One morning, she found a bird's nest on the windowsill, abandoned but intact. She brought it inside and placed it above the mantel. When he noticed, he didn't ask why. He only nodded. The land began to thaw under their feet. He built a coop for the hens, helped her dig a new row for winter cabbage. Once, when a storm broke a window, he nailed the boards shut from the outside while the rain soaked his back. She watched through the glass, something tightening in her chest. It wasn't romance. Not yet. But it was trust. One afternoon, she found him staring out at the hills, eyes fixed on the line of trees where the sky met the earth. He didn't hear her come near. "What is it?" she asked. He paused. "This place is quieter than any I've ever known, and that's good?" "I don't know." His voice was heavy with something unsaid. And for the first time, she reached out not to comfort, but to anchor. Her hand touched his arm, and he didn't flinch. "You can leave," she said. "If you want." He looked at her then, and something in his face broke open. "I did leave," he said, "and I ended up here again that night." She sat beside him on the porch. The stars stretched so wide above them, it felt like they might fall in. He handed her a flask, and she took a sip without asking what was in it. "I killed a man once," he said. She didn't move. Two, actually. But only one mattered. She waited. He hurt someone who couldn't fight back. I made sure he wouldn't do it again. She exhaled slowly, then said, "Good." The fire in the hearth behind them crackled, throwing light against the door. They didn't speak again that night. But when they went inside, he laid his coat across the foot of her bed and slept a little closer to the fire. Winter came slow, but they didn't feel it the way they used to. Because in that small house near Hollow Creek, two people who'd been broken by different winds had begun to share the same roof, the same rhythm, the same silence. And somehow, that silence no longer felt like loneliness. It began with hoofbeats, distant at first, faint as heartbeats beneath soil. But he heard them before she did. He was chopping firewood when he paused mid-swing, axe hanging still in the air. His eyes narrowed, head tilted toward the wind. No birds sang. The quiet had changed. Mary stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on a rag. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He set the axe down and walked past her, slow and deliberate, to the shed where he kept the rifle. When he came back, his face had turned to stone. "Get inside," he said. She didn't argue. From the window, she watched as three riders came into view over the rise. Not fast, not loud. That made it worse. The way they moved like men who knew no one would stop them. The first was tall and thin, with a silver star pinned to his coat and a mouth twisted in a smile that had no warmth. The second was younger, hat low over his brow, hand never far from the grip of his pistol. The third was older, with a scar across his throat that spoke of a wound survived, but never healed. They rode straight to the gate, dismounted without tying their horses, and walked toward the porch like it was theirs. The gunslinger stepped out to meet them. His rifle stayed lowered, but his stance said more than any bullet could. Mary remained, just behind the door, watching through the gap. The man with the star spoke first. "Well, look what the cold dragged back. Didn't think we'd find you this far east." "You didn't," the gunslinger replied. "You found her," the older man let out. A laugh like gravel. "She yours now? She's not your concern. Everything on this land is my concern," the one with the star said, "including debts unpaid and names unspoken." "I'm not hiding," the gunslinger said, "just staying warm." The younger one stepped forward, eyes sharp. "We heard you killed a marshal in Tule Ridge." "I heard he wasn't a marshal. Just a man with a badge and no soul," the one with the scar spit into the dirt. "Justice is still justice, friend." Mary stepped out then, slow and steady, eyes clear. "If you've got business with him, you can speak it plain. But you won't do it with riddles and boots on my porch." They looked at her, truly looked, and something changed in their eyes. "Lady," the star man said, tipping his hat with mock reverence, "you don't know who you've let into your bed." "I know enough." The gunslinger's voice came low. "She's not involved. Too late for that," the younger one said. "She's involved. The moment you stepped foot on her land, the man with the scar finally spoke. There's a bounty, boy. Blood money. Folks want you dead or gone." The gunslinger didn't blink. "I'll leave." Mary turned to him, stunned. "I'll leave tonight," he said again, louder this time. "You come back at dawn. If I'm still here, do what you came to do." The men exchanged glances, surprised by the offer. The star man smiled thin. "You've got till sunup then." They mounted up and rode off, leaving dust and unease behind. Inside, the fire had burned low. Mary stood by it, arms crossed, heart hammering. "You're not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her like he might argue, but she didn't give him room. "I didn't drag you out of the snow to watch you get gunned down on my land. If I stay, they'll kill us both. If you go, they'll come back for me anyway." He ran a hand down his face, weary. "This isn't your fight. It became mine the moment you told them I was your bride." Silence stretched between them, heavy as smoke. Then, "I'm not a good man, Mary." She stepped close, voice steady. "I don't need good. I need true." He breathed in sharp, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. Outside, the sky had begun to fade. The last light of day stretched shadows across the land. "They'll come at dawn," he said. "Then we'll meet them together." He looked at her like she was something holy. Then he turned, loaded the rifle, and said no more. That night, neither of them slept. Dawn broke like a knife. No softness, no golden light. Just a cold sky splitting over the ridge, bleeding gray across the snow-packed fields. The kind of morning that made men believe in omens. Mary stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, her breath a steady mist in the air. She wore her brother's coat, too large for her shoulders, but it held her upright. Beneath it, her heart drummed like hooves in dirt. Inside, he waited. The gunslinger had been still all night, sitting by the fire that now glowed faint orange. He hadn't spoken since midnight, and Mary hadn't tried to fill the silence. Words would have broken something sacred between them. Some pact made in glances, and the space between footfalls. When she stepped inside, he was strapping on his belt 2 pistols, 1 knife, and something in his eyes that didn't exist when he first arrived. Purpose, maybe, or the will to live for someone other than himself. "They're coming," she said. He nodded once. I'm not going back to what I was, she added, not to being looked through, not to quiet shame and half-lives. If I die today, it'll be standing beside someone who saw me. He crossed the room in 3 slow steps, took her face in his hands, and kissed her quiet and reverent, like she was the last prayer he ever meant. No promises, no declarations, just breath shared between 2 people who had never known the sound of being chosen. Then he turned, opened the door, and walked out to meet the morning. They were already there, all 3 of them, guns drawn, horses restless, and behind them, a 4th man someone knew, broad-shouldered, cloak dusted with frost, a man who didn't wear a badge, but who clearly carried the weight of command. Mary stepped to his side. The scarred one pointed. She's got no part in this. She has every part, the gunslinger said. She's why I'm still breathing, the man with the star laughed. Then this is gonna be real poetic. You've got one chance, the gunslinger said, raising his voice. You walk away now, and this ends here. No one moved. Then the stranger in the cloak spoke. You're supposed to die in Thule Ridge. I didn't. That's a problem. Behind them. Wind lifted dust like smoke. A hawk circled overhead. Mary tightened her grip on the shotgun. Her hands didn't shake. The youngest of the 3 riders dismounted and took a step forward. She raised her voice not loud but clear. Take another step, and you'll find out what kind of woman he married. The men froze. The silence was absolute. Even the trees seemed too still. Then the leader nodded once. The younger man blinked. What? Mount up, the leader said. We're done here. The man with the star looked furious. This ain't justice. No, the cloaked man said. It's something older than justice. It's a debt, and it's been paid. The gunslinger didn't lower his weapon. The riders turned, one by one, and left the same way they came, silent, deliberate, without looking back. When the last hoofprint vanished from sight, the gunslinger exhaled. Mary set down the shotgun on the porch rail and let her shoulders fall. You lied, she said, not looking at him. About what? That I was your bride. He turned to her, slow. I did. She met his eyes. And he said, steady as sunrise, but if you'll have me, I'd like to make it true. She didn't speak. Just stepped forward, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her cheek against his chest. Inside his coat, his heart beat like thunder. Finally finding a place to land, the days that followed passed like smoke through fingers, slow, warm, almost unreal. No one came back. No letters. No riders. No guns. Just silence, now softer. The kind that settles in a house and turns it into a home. He moved his things from beside the hearth to the spare room, but he never closed the door. And every night, Mary would find his coat hung beside hers, not apart anymore, but equal. He built her a new henhouse with cedar from the grove east of the creek. She cooked more than she ever did before, stew enough for 2, bread enough for breakfast, and again by supper. Neither said aloud what was becoming of them, but it was clear in the things they touched. The way her hand brushed his when passing. A spoon. The way he lingered at the doorway just long enough for her to catch the scent of rain on his coat. She still woke before him. She always had. One morning, she found him out by the fence, watching the sunrise. The light fell across his back in soft gold. For the first time, she noticed the gray at his temples, the tired peace in the way he stood. You sleep at all? She asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He turned, smiling faint. Enough. She came beside him, leaned on the post. "There's a letter in town," he said. "For me, maybe. Maybe not. Name's not one I use anymore. You going to get it?" "Maybe." They stood in silence a while, the land stretching out before them quiet, patient. The sky painted in muted reds, not yet the harsh blue of full day. "What would you have done," she asked softly, "if I hadn't pulled you out of the snow that night?" He didn't answer right away. Then died thinking no one ever meant it when they said my name. She looked at him, not blinking. And he said, "Now I know better," that afternoon. She found an old locket in a drawer her mother's, long since broken. She laid it on the table, dusted it off, and left it open. Inside, a dried sprig of sagebrush. She'd once tucked away for no reason. When he saw it, he picked it up, studied it a moment, then asked, "Can I fix the clasp?" She nodded. He did that same evening by the fire, using a rusted pin and more care than most men gave their prayers. That night, they sat on the porch again, as they always did. But this time, his hand found hers without hesitation. Their fingers laced, slow and sure. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he let it rest there, quiet and still. "I was a stranger," he said after a long pause. "And you gave me your name, your roof, your fire." "I gave you a chance," she whispered. He nodded. "And I'm still learning what to do with it." The moon rose behind them, casting long shadows across the field. The air was cold, but neither of them moved. She didn't say she loved him. He didn't promise forever. But when he kissed her that time, it was not out of fear or desperation. It was quiet, sure, like the last line of a letter sent years ago and finally read aloud. The kind of kiss that said, "I'm not running anymore." And she believed him. Winter passed gently that year. Snow came late and melted early, as if the land itself was tired of carrying sorrow. The wind still howled through the trees some nights, but not in morning. More like an old friend whistling past the door to let them know it hadn't forgotten them, but didn't need to stay. The townsfolk began to notice things. A new line of smoke rising from her chimney. A man walking beside her at the market, shoulders wide and quiet, face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. They whispered, of course, but this time their voices held no mockery. Just wonder. Just the soft rustle of something mended where it once lay broken. He didn't leave. He repaired the barn, planted seed before the thaw, learned to make coffee the way she liked it, too strong, too hot. She didn't say thank you. He didn't ask for praise. It was in the way they looked at each other across the table, the way his hand would rest briefly on the small of her back as she passed, the way she folded his shirts and laid them at the foot of the bed, even when they had no plans to go anywhere. Some evenings, she read aloud from the books she thought she'd never open again. He didn't understand every word, but he liked the sound of her voice carrying across the room, like rain on a tin roof, like memory without ache. And some mornings, he'd rise early to check the fence line, find a rabbit in the snare, or brush frost from the pump handle. One morning, he came back to find her sleeping in his coat on the porch swing, the rising sun casting gold across her closed eyelids. He didn't wake her. He just stood there, still as the hills behind them, and thought to himself, this is what it feels like to be held by the world and not flinch. Then spring arrived. The trees bloomed in stubborn little clusters. The fields softened. The mule birthed a foal no one expected. And one evening, while digging a hole for a fence post, he found a rusted tin box. Inside, old coins, a broken knife, and a letter never sent. He showed it to her. She read it aloud, her voice steady. It was from a man who had once owned the land, writing to a woman he never married, telling her he had built the cabin with her in mind, that even though she belonged to another, he hoped someday she'd walk those halls and feel safe. Mary folded the letter, placed it in the drawer by the stove. "It belongs here," she said. He nodded. That night, as they stood beneath a sky so full of stars, it looked like the heavens had split open. She turned to him and asked, "Do you believe people can start over?" He didn't answer right away. Then he reached for her hand and said, "We didn't start over, Mary. We just kept walking when we were supposed to fall." She smiled. And that house, once heavy with silence, filled with the sound of her laughter low, warm and alive. From that day on, the porch swing never sat empty for long. The fence held strong through wind and time. The garden grew crooked but full. And the man who came back with a gun and a secret never raised his voice again, because the woman who once saved a stranger had taught him something the desert never could. That mercy remembered becomes love returned. Since that morning, the porch never faced the dawn alone again.